Hello, everyone. Thanks, Priyanka, for that lovely film. In fact, when I watched the film to prepare for this conversation, I had a very different expectation of the film. And I think that's really because of the partition cinema that we are used to watching. You know, there is a certain sort of violence to the film, there is a certain discourse that we are used to. And your film really did disrupt that. It broke that. You have brought in a certain diverse view, a certain complexity, you know, looking at the story of the personal narrative of the refugee and making the refugee narrative your protagonist of the film it really did stay with me. So what I want to begin with in the conversation is just for you to just talk about this work that you have been doing, and Iqrarnama is the second in a trilogy of things that you have done around partition. So tell us a little bit about Pichla Varka and how the genesis of this film lies in that, and also the work that you're continuing with.
Thanks, Subhashri and Urban Lens and the team for having the film here, and also to IFA who have generously supported the film. In terms of, this is the second iteration of my sort of, concern with the partition, and I'm like a third generation person from a family of partition refugees from Punjab. And my concern actually started not so much with the partition, but with a kind of portrait of the neighborhood that I grew up in Delhi, which is West Delhi. And I was curious about why is West Delhi the way it is? Why, what are the characteristics which are kind of missing, where there is this romantic idea of Delhi with its monuments and everything, which is not what West Delhi is. So I wanted to kind of look at the neighborhood, how it came up, and then I sort of got on to exploring my grandmother and her group of friends who would play rummy every afternoon, which is a very common thing in Punjabi families. And I realized that all of her friends who were above 60, 70 were partition refugees. And that's where the sort of seed of Pichla Varka came. And Pichla Varka translates to the previous page and kind of is in reference to Amrita Pritam's poem, where she invokes Varisha and she talks about opening the next page of love. So we were kind of looking back and trying to look at how these women who either firsthand or through their parents experienced the partition, how did they remember it? And what I realized was that actually they chose to forget certain things, and then of course they remembered certain aspects of rebuilding their lives in Delhi, not so much the violence that you're talking about. And even if they remembered it, they sort of remembered it as kind of this confusion of identity, because a lot of them were leaving Karachi, for example, or Lahore, being saved by their Muslim neighbors and in a hijab or something like that, and then crossing over. And so those were their sort of memories. And so Pichla Varka was about experiences and also of experiences of growing old in the domestic space of the house. And through one of my grandmother's friends, I met Mr. Bangia, and it was just a chance conversation where I was also looking at objects that they might have picked up when they came over. And Sunita auntie said that, oh, my brother-in-law, he's 90 and he'll remember something, and they, I think, have a single sewing machine, which is in Pichla Varka, it's not here. So I called him up and he said, yes, of course, I remember a lot. And just the way he started his story was very interesting, because he kind of historically located it as the beginning of the violence, where he was in Lealpur, which is now Faisalabad, and they heard on the news that Master Tara Singh has torn the Jhanda of the Muslim League, and I didn't know anything about Master Tara Singh at that time, whereas he was also an important part in the politics of Punjab at that time. So then I followed his story and I went to meet him in Amritsar, and he's playing a small sort of part in Pichla Varka, where he's making this so-called political point about the allotment of houses, whereas his sister-in-law, who's sitting right next to him, saying the same thing, and it looks like as if she's not making a political point, he is. So there's that sort of gendered narrative that comes out in that. But when I met him in Amritsar, he brought out these files from his box bed, where he had all these papers. And I was like really intrigued by this collection. And that's the first time actually that I encountered the Department of Evacuee Property and the Relief and Rehabilitation Department. And then he told me his story of how they had applied for compensation. And that just got me thinking, okay, I had no clue that this is also what was going on. Where people who came, they kind of occupied these houses in Delhi as well and in other places, but specifically in Amritsar, since that was his story. So he occupies this house which was lying abandoned, because in Amritsar also a lot of people had left for Pakistan. And that's where I sort of got interested. He occupied the house and he renovated it. Then he was allotted that house by the custodian to which he was paying rent. Then later they became owners of that house. And later when I revisited some of those documents which I had scanned originally for Pichla Varka, I realized that there is a whole narrative going on over here, where he has like his earliest document, which is actually the Iqrarnama, which is the land deed, which is where the film gets its name from, of the house that the land on which they built the house in Lyalpur, near Jarawala Mandi, and that's about 1932. And then he has the library card of Lyalpur Government College. Then he has these certificates which were given to him by the department here when he worked as a student in the refugee camp after he came to Amritsar. And by doing that social service as a volunteer, he was exempted from writing an English paper because he was in his BA third year. So these were sort of things that I also wanted to use to, and the idea of the personal archive was a construction from my end, because I found the documents just lying around. And I thought that, okay, this is interesting that I construct this as a personal archive and then tell his story as a refugee or a displaced person, which are categories which are then at that point invented by the state and put into, laws like the Displaced Persons Act and all that, and then see what kind of conversation emerges between the refugee and the state. So that was the sort of...
Of the personal narrative, you have also juxtaposed two texts, and done that beautifully. And it really elevates the film. And so just tell us a little bit about how you went about choosing this text by Krishna Sopti and Joginder Paul, and how, while editing, or I don't know if when they came into the picture, how did you kind of configure it in the film? And also the impressions it leaves you with. Like for me, when I saw the film, I thought it was it juxtaposed very well with a sense, like a stoic way of the way Bangya talks about, his property, his house, the various documents that he has. And then there is this longing which the text bring in, a certain, eccentric longing, obsessive longing. So, I mean, that's my reading of it, but please tell us how you went about it.
It's a novella called Khwabru, which is originally in Urdu, and this is a translation that I've referred to, which is done by his daughter, Sukrita Paul. And this is a story I had read, some time ago in one of those Kali collections. And I always thought this character of Diwane Maulvi Sahab was like very interesting in how he has constructed this Lucknow in himself, and he carries it, and he refuses to believe that there is a Lucknow in India, and the Lucknow is where he is. So, and Krishna Sopti's novel Zindagi Nama came out after a long time. I think it was in a court case and the translation was not available. So I wanted to read it to understand, because she looks at basically this village called Gujarat in Punjab and pre-partition Punjab. So there is so much of, this sociological kind of rendering of life in that book. But when I was trying to construct this narrative of the refugee who came from, Lyalpur to Amritsar, what I realized was missing was the narrative of people who left, because the houses that were occupied, like one of the documents in Uncle's archive is the allotment order, where all it says that this house belonged to a Muslim. And I tried to kind of go to the custodian department, which now is named differently, doesn't exist as it used to be, to find out if there is a paper trail, if we can find out who this person is. So in some way I tried to kind of transpose that onto, or project that onto the character of Diwane Maulvi Sahab. And that was a way for me to try and create this parallel narrative of this kind of, like you're saying, a stoic kind of rendering of, paperwork and all the kind of running around that and logistics that has to be done in rebuilding a life, and this kind of emotionality of what it means to leave a home, I think that comes out more in his family's, Diwan Maulvi Saab's, or the person in the end who says that, you know, oh, I'm feeling like Lucknow is here, and he's saying obviously because, you know, it's only tourists like you who come and go. And then he talks about, so that I think for me completed the story. So the text came later, but what was even more interesting for me is I was trying to, initially I had thought that I'll have some people read out certain excerpts. And I also wanted Siya Hashya, which is Manto's flash fictions, to be part of, to bring in maybe some part of that aspect of violence. But because those, I mean, most of what we've read of Manto are like, you know, short stories. But these black margins, ke jo chote stories, those kind of bring out this completely surreal atmosphere. And the tone is also of this really dark humor. But that somehow didn't work out. So I was trying to see if I can get people to read out these excerpts. And I had chosen some portions. And then during my research, and a lot of it is done on the internet, for example, the text that I've used from the Constituent Assembly debates, all of that is, or Jawaharlal Nehru's letters, all of that are, you know, publicly available on the internet. I found recordings of these stories in the voices of the author. So what you're hearing Joginder Paul's voice reading out his own story. And he was also a partition refugee. And when I met his daughter in Delhi, she told me how they grew up in Kenya, but they didn't know Kenya so much as home as they knew what he left behind. So somewhere he's also, and I feel in literature, I think this kind of emotional landscape of the of people who left their homes has been explored with a lot more complexity than in cinema. So for me, it was also important to somehow make some kind of a cinematic image of that as well. And Krishna Sopti's excerpt is also read out in her voice. And so in that sense, I've thought that it was interesting that I could bring in these different voices in the film, and not just Mr. Bangia's voice. Because I wanted to explore a kind of multiple set of voices located, they're not located in Amritsar, and there are no markers of, you know, what you are seeing as Amritsar. And like we were talking earlier, it can look like Delhi to some people. But yeah, I wanted to kind of explore that space of the city through some of these voices.
Should I open it now or continue? Okay. No, I just have one question. Just to kind of understand your personal journey. You did start off by, you said, investigating West Delhi. That is how the Pichla Varka started off. But you have stuck through this journey of partition of Punjab, right? And we have been talking about this as well, that, you know, why did you choose to continue with it? And what has your personal, motivation is the wrong word, personal journey maybe, through this?
Yeah, I think it took me some time to articulate this as well, but for me, I think at the core of it, and this is something I've found resonating with others who have also worked on the partition, is this kind of psychological hole where you cannot figure out where do you belong, where are you coming from. For example, when I went out from Delhi, meeting other people, and everyone has an ancestral place that they're coming from, and not knowing where you're coming from, because if you're from Delhi, you're actually not from Delhi. You're possibly from somewhere else. So I couldn't locate that, and that was the sort of search in trying to find out that if we speak a certain kind of Punjabi at home, which actually is not the same when you go to Punjab, then where does it belong to? Because it has a mix of Urdu words. My grandfather used to read an Urdu newspaper, and we saw him reading that growing up. So you couldn't kind of figure out how all of this comes together. And while making Pichla Varka, for example, I discovered that one of those spaces, which is called the Derawal Bhavan, which was made by people who came from Dera Ghazi Khan and all these other places in what is now Pakistan, set up for themselves, and they have this kind of yearly and even Multan, yearly celebration of, because the language is different, is Multani. And I used to think that it's just some kind of banquet hall. But when I went to shoot it for Pichla Varka, I realized that on the facade there is a whole map of the different places, and all those places are in Pakistan. That, the people who live there or have contributed to the making and the maintenance of that building, that's where they come from. So all these clues, and there's I think one Miyawali Bhavan also somewhere there. So all of these things then started coming together, and when I started making Iqrarnama and reading more about the custodian of evacuee property and what happened in Delhi and how the sort of demography of that city changed, it made me think about, okay, so then, there are also people who left here, and there are people who chose to stay, and then there are people who came. Like Delhi now is seen as a Punjabi city, but that's not what it was. And there is a reason for the way it is the way it is. And for example, I was reading Anis Kidwai's In Freedom's Shade, and there she talks about a lot of the work she was doing when there were, camps set up in Humayun's tomb and in Jama Masjid at the time of the partition. So so in that sense, there were many of these sort of aspects that kind of also emerged while I was, and there was just no way that I could drop the ball on it. So even after making Iqrarnama, I felt that, I couldn't include all the documents, and somehow the material, the fact that this is paper, and now Mr. Bangia couldn't watch the film. He passed away before the film was made. Even my grandmother passed away before Pichla Varka was made. So, and I also tried to go to the archives, and if you're not sort of associated with an institution, it's very hard to access these spaces. Trying to find out if they would accept some of these documents. And I realized it's not that easy, so I decided to then do a book, which will be an artist book, which will have all the documents. And now I'm thinking that maybe I'll stop after that.
Hi, I wanted to know at what point you decided not to use traditional B-roll and instead use jump cuts in the interviews.
I think I haven't ever thought of, classifying footage as B-roll, because I also work as an editor. So when I look at material, it's all material. Like, even if the camera is shaking or falling or whatever, it's all footage which adds to, what is it that the film is trying to do. But the other thing was also that when I was shooting with Mr. Bangia was just before the lockdown, just before the first wave, and he passed away in August of 2020. And he was unwell and he was old, so there was not much that I could do in terms of, I had all these ideas that I'll take him here and I'll go to the places which are mentioned in the documents. So there was that kind of limitation of what I could shoot. But yeah, I think I've always thought of, of just being able to cut to whatever you want to. So I don't think the idea of a B-roll is very helpful in this kind of filmmaking. Maybe television, but yeah, not here.
Thank you for such a lovely film. I was very curious about the artwork that you have included in the film. So, I just wanted to know the process, the eyes that keeps moving around. I think that was the most, touching part in the film for me. So I just wanted to know at what point you thought that, you could use this medium also while weaving the story.
I wanted to do a lot with this film. Like, I wanted to put in a whole lot of things. And the drawing was one way for me, I think, to kind of animate the documents, because I felt that there is a certain inertness to the documents, but then they are also kind of peopled and with all these names that show up. So what is the best way that I can do that? And then I tried the drawings, and sort of I didn't want to go into like a full-fledged animation kind of thing. So I decided to sort of work on them in a certain kind of way, juxtapose them with the composite them onto the documents. But the eyes, kind of the idea came with, I was reading up a lot on this history of the rehabilitation, and there's a very well-known book called Out of Ashes by M.S. Randhawa, and he describes the whole, he was, I think, the rehabilitation officer at that time for rural Punjab, and he describes the entire process of how this thing was carried out. And there's the scene where he's describing they're kind of trying to, because they were trying to rehabilitate members of the same village together in one place, so to give them houses, close to each other. So in a village, they're kind of having this group conversation, and one person, and that's what I chose to kind of, play out in against one of the documents, is that they're having this conversation that these are the three kinds of houses which are available for allotment, and people can choose. So one person says that they want a house inside the village, but they also have another plot, and how that is not allowed. And I was just trying to visualize this kind of group conversation, and then I just chose the most basic kind of element from that conversation, which would be like many people's eyes. And we tried to work with the sound design in creating that kind of, atmosphere where people are kind of squabbling or arguing about this. So that's where it came up from.
No, this is personal curiosity. Not just for this film, even Pichla Varka, which is conversations, right? And even for this film. So both your films actually work in the realm of memory in many ways. And of course, documents and the paper trail. So I was just curious, when you were talking to them, whether on camera or off camera, do they have memories of the time of apart from their own individual experience and memory and of Punjab, any memories of what may have happened in Bengal or Assam? I don't know. I'm just curious if that's something that's part of their landscape or mental man in any ways in their conversation with you.
No, actually, it didn't come up. I think, but what also happens is that some of these conversations are happening even with me for the first time, or even within their family for the first time. So I feel like the partition is such a reactive subject that the moment you touch it, it kind of opens up so many other things. And also with Punjab, like even though, he was living in Amritsar, they didn't have a lot of family in Punjab as such. There were some people they knew who went to Khanna or a few other places, or he was going to Jalandhar, for example, for the compensation and everything. So there is so much in Punjab itself that is still to be spoken about, that I think the conversation never drifted further away from there. Yeah.
Okay, I think can I ask her a question? I just wanted to know, because you told him about the material and the conversations. Was there material that you did not include in the film? Were they conversations or thoughts or even documents that you think did not fit in the film, or for whatever reason you could not incorporate it?
This thing came up for us in Pichla Varka, where we were, and I'll come to Ikranama, with Pichla Varka, where we felt that we didn't want to include something which kind of taps into the current kind of situation that we're in, and even or allows for that kind of co-opting of the partition narrative to kind of against a certain community. And Ikrarnama, there was a conversation that I wanted to keep between his son and between Mr. Bangya and his son. And I wasn't sure how it kind of plays off the other information in the film. For example, he was at that time when he came, also I think doing some amount of social service with the RSS, because they were an organization who were doing a lot of work with the refugees. But how does that translate into our current context? As an excerpt from what he's saying. So that was something that was a bit tricky, and I decided to not use it because it didn't have the space to open out the different kind of places that, let's say, his son was coming from and where he was coming from and how that conversation was happening between them. So that is something that I wanted to be careful about, and we were definitely careful about with Pichla Varka. Especially since we were not wanting to include instances of violence which then get picked up very easily and become like, this is what happened to us and this is what, without ever going into what we did. Which is where Delhi becomes interesting for me. Because that actually in the context of Delhi or Delhi's history doesn't get spoken about so much. So in that sense, yeah, those were the two instances.
Okay. I think I can keep asking her questions, but we'll wrap. Thank you so much.